Well, hey, and welcome back to the Mandan Seventh-day Adventist Church podcast. I'm Pastor Kris, and I'm here with my co-host, Luke. How's it going, Luke?
Oh, pretty good. How about you, Kris?
Hey, I'm doing pretty well, yeah. Good week so far?
Pretty good.
Good.
Way too much going on, but that's every week, so
right.
Nothing unusual. No, I'm pretty excited to get into this episode. We're actually going to be talking about a really interesting topic today. It's going to be a little less like delving into a specific Bible topic and more about a topic that we encounter in our lives. So, Kris, maybe you want to explain a little more about that.
Yeah, so last Sabbath, we explored what it means to be called by God and how to discern that calling in our lives. And again, just some recap here. We're in a series where we are asking anything. So questions are being submitted from the church congregation. And this question was asked is, how does calling express itself in our lives? How do you know you're called? What if you're unsure about your calling? And if other people have doubt about your calling and they say that to you, like, how do you deal with that? So it's definitely a subject that seems to resonate with a lot of folks. And so I'm glad we have had the chance to discuss it in a sermon and explore some more discussion and question on it in this episode.
So I think that we have to start out in our discussion about calling with the basic premise that every believer has a purpose. I mean, you can read in, I believe it's Romans 8, that it talks about that God works things for good for those who love him, for those who follow him. And so I think that that's just a general premise that we can build off.
In fact, like we did in the sermon, Ephesians 2 verse 10 says, "For we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus," and here's the interesting part, "to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do." So we've been made for a purpose to do good works, and the good works that we are made to do, God had already prepared in advance for us to do. In other words, the calling has already been extended. So first and foremost, I want to say that every human being has a call. That is pretty much across the board. I think or maybe I should say every human being has a purpose. How that purpose expresses itself in details in a call might be a little bit more challenging to discern sometimes. Yeah.
No, I totally agree. Like, one thing, like, calling can almost seem like, oh, this is formal full-time ministry. Like, for example, what you do, Kris, you're in full-time ministry.
Yep.
For instance, I'm not. But I actually had questions about that when I was young, because I was like, so how do you do the Lord's work without actually being in full-time ministry? And I don't think that's just me. I think that's a pretty common question. And I will say what kind of finally did it was when I realized you don't have to be in full-time ministry to do a lot of work for God. I'd say some of the most active members of a church are by no means in full-time ministry.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, it's not full-time, obviously, but some people manage to shuffle a lot more than I do.
Yeah. And I mean, you may have someone who's retired, or you may just have someone who's really passionate about something, and maybe it's an expression of service. So here in Bismarck, we have Heaven's Helper Soup Kitchen. So let's say that you're so passionate about serving people. It brings you joy. You're extroverted maybe in nature. You don't have to be, certainly. But let's just say so you like that interaction with people. And so it might just be something that you want to make more time for in your week, and maybe your schedule allows it. I think a lot of people find this. We find ourselves in an interesting point in world history where people tend to just be more busy. I think I've listened to so many other pastors and theologians talk about this, and not just pastors and theologians, but psychologists. Busyness has taken control, and people are feeling like feelings of burnout, and they're feeling like they're being overextended, and in some parts the cause for that could be a dopamine rush. We are consuming so much stuff. There's so much content to consume. There's Netflix episodes to catch up on, or maybe it's like The Chosen or a series that you're trying to catch up. It might be this podcast that you're trying to catch up on. And
That'd be awesome.
yeah, I mean, and that's a good thing. But at the same time, are you maybe losing track of some of the other things that are important in your life? Because I think in general, getting busy with our hands and our feet in the sense of serving people and service to people, this is something that I wish was talked about more. But service always looks very like you have to either go to another country, like a third world country is usually who gets picked on. So we go to Zambia. We're going to go build an orphanage in Zambia. And I heard this expressed as a joke the other day. Like there's so much truth to this. Is like a church organizes a mission trip here in America, and we say, hey, we're going to come and build an orphanage in your town in Zambia. And the people in that town are like, that's awesome. We would love that. Are you sending your contractors and builders? No, we're sending our teenagers. They're going to come and build this orphanage for you. Like they have no experience. It's illegal for them to work here, but in your country, they can get away with it because it's mission work. And then, so we're not sending our best and bright minds necessarily. No offense to teenagers. There's an opportunity to hire architects and people in that city or in that town, and that would actually boost the economy and actually benefit the community even more than just a flyby mission trip, so to speak.
From a cost perspective, it probably costs less to hire them at a good wage than to fly all these teenagers over from America.
Right, exactly. But, if you don't fly, you can't get the pictures with the kids. And so,
no.
Anyways, that sounded really cynical, and I don't mean to be cynical, but sometimes, some things like this, which I don't think there's an evil agenda here. I think genuinely we think, oh, we want to go on a mission trip and help out. Like there's genuineness and realness behind that. There's maybe just like an additional consideration for like, how does your presence actually affect the community that you're serving? Is there a way that you could be benefiting that community with the funds that you are expending on this trip?
There.
Yeah, I was just going to trace back a little bit here. Your initial question was, what does a call look like outside of full-time ministry?
Right.
Because in your family, like you said, you're not in full-time ministry. What do you do as work right now? You're a student and...
Well, I'm a student and also I'm part-time land surveying.
Yes.
I'll be full-time in the spring when I finish school.
Right.
But,
and then your brother, on the other hand, he is studying to be a pastor.
Yeah.
Is pastoring in Wyoming currently, like as an associate internship kind of role.
Right.
So that's sort of close to home there. I think one of the things that we need to understand is that full-time ministry doesn't always require a paycheck and benefits.
Nice.
It's nice, and I feel very privileged to get paid and have benefits for what I do. Now, it certainly isn't the exorbitant salaries that some mega church pastors get, but certainly, yeah, like it's a privilege. I really enjoy that. But everywhere we go, and I think I've mentioned this in my sermon as well, is like there are people that you're going to interact with on a day-to-day basis in your classes at Bismarck State University. There are going to be people that you interact with when you go out surveying land.
We encourage the
ignorance.
The ignorance. We like to be out of the public eye.
Yeah,
That's why there are no news stories on surveyors.
maybe you guys just have all the fun out there and you don't want us to know, and you can't
Absolutely.
answer that question, right? So, um,
Absolutely, I'm pleading the fifth on that.
but I think like you're gonna encounter people, you're gonna meet people that a full-time pastor or missionary or whatever typical ministry job title you can insert there, they're never going to meet them. They're never
No.
going to have the opportunity to tell them about Jesus. They're never going to be able to minister to them, hearing their hurts and their cries and their longings. And you have the ability just in that space to enter in and say, hey, I am here to be a friend. And guess what? You're doing ministry. And that's ultimately God's call for us as people. Before I quiet down here, C.S. Lewis wrote this. He says the church exists for nothing else but to draw men into Christ, to make them little Christs. If they are not doing that, all the cathedrals, all the clergy, the missions, the sermons, even the Bible itself is a waste of time. So that's C.S. Lewis's statement. Like this whole idea that the church's job, the church is not a building, it's the people. That our job as people is to the best of our ability, embody the traits of Jesus to those around us and to lead them to also want that life.
Right. No, and to kind of get back to what we were talking about a little earlier, one thing that a lot of people run into with calling is, how do you know? Because it can get pretty distracting.
Mm-hmm.
And so I kind of think that a lot of times you just, and I'm sure you've heard this way too many times, but you just need to walk away from all the busyness. For sometimes you just need what I call alone time.
Yeah.
Like for me, I'll go out on a long walk in the prairie or something and just think. Don't even put music on. If you want to, you can. You can even listen to this podcast, but just take some time to think and kind of let God speak to you because, well, I'm definitely guilty of this. I don't know if any of our listeners have this problem, but I know I'm really, really good at the 30-second prayer.
Yeah.
I've mastered it down to a T.
Half seconds.
Yeah, you kind of can't just do that. You have to actually listen to God, not just
I think
get off an order.
Absolutely. No, I think you're nailing it here and you bring up an interesting point because I think when we think about prayer, there's this idea that I do all the talking, and I think Jesus never explicitly taught this aspect of prayer necessarily, but he lived it.
Right.
Because he teaches, the disciples come to him, they ask him, Lord, teach us to pray. And so he teaches them this format that we call the Lord's Prayer. And look, that might be a 30-second prayer. So maybe 30-second prayers aren't bad. They're not evil. You're not neglecting. Sometimes that's all we can muster on some days, and that's okay. Like God understands our circumstances more than we ourselves can understand them at some times. I think, though, that the practice that Jesus participated in fairly regularly is he went out early in the morning to a place where he was alone.
Mm-hmm.
And he just spent time in the presence of his Father. Whether he was praying, actually speaking, or just listening, or just calming the noise, whatever it is, we need to do that. And especially because we are so busy, because we have this epidemic of busyness in the world that we live in, there's so many distractions. We talked about this like before we recorded this episode. We talked about like how, the foolishness of pursuing, either having more or having less, or even like the idea that if I can just if I can be more efficient, then I'll have more time for other things. And like, the irony of being more efficient being more efficient at your work means that your employers are going to give you a high five, and tomorrow they're going to give you more work because now you've proved that you can handle more. So the reward for being efficient at work is not less work, it's more work. So it's like we live in this system where it just seems to like busyness begets busyness. And if we don't intentionally take time to stop, to stand aside, to sit in the stillness and in the presence of God, maybe it just means total quietness and hearing his voice. What does he have to say? If we don't make time for it, then we won't hear it.
That's definitely the truth, because that is the curse of modernity, I guess you might say. Is like, well, for instance, let's say 100 years ago, after it gets dark, all you have is maybe a little candlelight to read a book.
Mm-hmm.
And you probably only have 5 or 10 books on your bookshelf that you've read a dozen times.
Right.
Or 100 times.
Right.
And so, yeah, you're just going to take it easy and just sit there and either talk to each other or even go to bed early. Now, there's Netflix.
Right.
And there's doom scrolling on Instagram.
Right. And I think I want to just say this too, is like, even sort of sometimes idealizing like living 100 years ago or 200 years ago and thinking that those are simpler times. In some ways, yes, but in other ways, no, because there were other things that you were running into, like worry and anxiety and stress has been something that has been part of the human existence for forever. I mean, even Jesus tells the people, he says, stop being so anxious for everything. And he's not talking about the condition of anxiety, like a diagnosed condition of anxiety where he's just saying stop. He's just talking about this level of stress that we all live with. And he's saying, just stop worrying for a little bit. Like he says, look at the birds of the sky. They have food to eat. They have nests, and God provides all of this for you. And you, whom God loves so much more than the birds, why wouldn't he provide for you as well? And not saying don't go work, don't put in the time, but just saying there will be provision for things. And you worrying and stressing about tomorrow and next week, ultimately it's not going to accomplish anything. Right. So, yeah. That being said, I think let's just be mindful. Just because we live in the 2020s, it wasn't different 50 years ago. It was different in some ways, but it wasn't all that different.
No, in a lot of ways, things don't change. But right. No, I do want to quickly touch on a couple of points. Like, for instance, a couple of questions that you might have is, how do you find your purpose if you don't feel like you've been called to something specific?
Okay.
And then another one is, what if others don't agree with your calling? What if they doubt your calling?
Right. So for the first one, I'm just going to answer that question with a quote. This is by one of my favorite authors and speakers and preachers, John Mark Comer. He says, sometimes a calling is staring us right in the face. We just need to make eye contact. In other words, you may already be busy with the thing that God has called you to, but you maybe have not thought about what you're doing in the context of doing it for God.
And that's definitely possible. Another way might be, you just kind of need to weigh your options. Like, most people, it's not going to be inherently obvious.
Right.
There's some that have like, they're incredibly skilled at this one thing and they're rather bad at everything else. But a lot of us, we're good at a few things and mediocre at a lot of things.
Yeah.
And a lot of times what we need to do is just try a lot of different things. And
Yeah, explore.
I'm not saying, like, for instance, my age, that's the time when you do that. I'm like 19. When you're at that age, just figure out what you want to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
You can try a few different career options in the spiritual sense, trying to figure out ways that you can serve God
Mm-hmm.
and just figure out what works for you. And then as far as people doubting it, you have to weigh their criticism against their bias. I've seen some people criticize, and their criticism makes sense. They have your best interest in mind. They see something that doesn't quite add up, and they want to tell you about it. And then there's some that don't really have your best interest in mind. Take advice from those who care about you.
I think that's appropriate because take it from whom it comes. So that's what I would say. Number one is like,
Absolutely.
who's that person in your life? Are they important? Are they worth listening to? If they are, maybe have a conversation with them, explore, be curious, and you'll sort of find out. Sometimes God can call us to something and we just have to follow it. I've always said this, that God's calling will be affirmed in the community, maybe not always directly, like after the call comes, but eventually. In the life of Paul, for instance, when he became an apostle, the other apostles, they were not ready to affirm his calling. And it wasn't until much later where he said, hey, I don't care if you guys think that I'm called or not, I'm doing this. And it was at that time they said, yes, we've seen the fruits of your labor. We've seen what you've done. We can see God's Spirit moving in your life. We affirm this.
Well, they thought he was a plant right away.
And I think it's a tension because there are some people who think that they are called to be rude and mean. Those are not the fruit of the Spirit, okay? So no, that's not a calling. You can't be rude and mean, or to just be out to lunch on every topic and every conversation, like called to be conspiracy theorist. No, that's,
it's fun.
Again, how does it build up the community of God, at the end of the day? And there's a text that I'm thinking of, I think it's in Isaiah, where it says like, don't busy yourselves with all these random conspiracies. Focus on what is important. I don't have the text at the top of my head, but I remember reading it once and I thought it was really, really interesting and helpful. But I think just practically, if you want to ascertain your calling, number one, everyone has a calling by God. God has created us for this purpose. Number two, how do you discern what it is that God is calling you to? Take some time to spend quiet time in his presence and ask him that question. Maybe you're already doing it and you haven't thought of your current job or your current passion or whatever it might be as a calling, but it might very well be. And God might have you right where he wants you to be. To be called by God does not necessarily mean being a missionary or a pastor or any of those things. If you're still unsure of what it is that God is calling you to, just get busy serving. Sometimes you will find that as you're helping, as you're serving, as you're meeting people's needs in a specific area, you might just find yourself becoming passionate about that. And often God uses our passion to drive us to lean into that more. We should allow ourselves to do that as well. If people are expressing doubts, consider who they are, what their influence is, have a conversation. If you still feel that God has called you, continue on cautiously.
Right. No, I think that's a really good way to end today's discussion.
Yeah.
I think we had a lot of insight into trying to figure out like how to know what your calling is and how to live it as well. Because I think a lot of these tips that we've talked about for finding a calling actually work very well just in daily life as well to keep us on track. Mm-hmm. So that's going to be it for today.
Yeah. A little bit
So-
longer podcast here,
Oh,
but yeah.
It's no big issue.
Yeah, right.
If you're listening on YouTube, which I mean, that's all we have it on right now.
Yeah.
We may get more in the future. Make sure to like the video. Make sure to hit that thumbs up button. And if you don't like it, hit the thumbs down button twice.
Twice. Yes.
If you
And-
like, and if you have any questions or comments, make sure to put them down in the comments section. And we'd really love to hear from you in the comments section. Subscribe to the video also, and make sure you hit the bell if that way that you can see when we put out future episodes.
And also our live streams.
Our church live streams are definitely on there as well. And with that, well, God bless.
We'll see you next time.